She said, "Friends with benefits?" I said, "Sure, but not with you." Her sister's wink at the family reunion nearly made her faint. I've always been the kind of guy who believes in doing things right, taking time to make moments special. 3 years with Brittany had taught me she appreciated the finer things, so I spent weeks planning what I thought would be our perfect anniversary celebration. The day would start at Charleston's premier boat show, where I'd arranged a private tour of a restored 1950s yacht I'd personally worked on, followed by dinner at Magnolia's, the exclusive waterfront restaurant that required calling 4 months ahead. I work in custom boat restoration, spending my days at my harborside workshop bringing vintage vessels back to their former glory. It's honest work that pays well, and I take genuine pride in preserving maritime history. My clients include wealthy collectors who understand the value of craftsmanship and the stories these boats carry. Brittany created lifestyle content about coastal living, building her brand around Charleston's charm, though she preferred photographing upscale restaurants and boutiques rather than actually experiencing the salt air and working docks that gave our city its character. She had 50,000 followers who loved her curated feed of sunset cocktails and designer outfits posed against historic backdrops. The boat show started perfectly. I was excited to show her the 1950s Bertram yacht I'd spent 8 months restoring, complete with original mahogany details and brass fittings. I thought Brittany would finally see my work the way I saw it, understand the skill and passion that went into every detail. She posed for photos with the yacht as a backdrop, but seemed more interested in checking who might be watching her than listening to me explain the restoration process. When I pointed out challenging aspects, she nodded absently while scrolling through her phone. Magnolia's had always been our dream restaurant, where Charleston's old money families celebrated anniversaries. The reservation had cost me a favor with a client, and I'd been looking forward to this dinner for months. Then everything changed when we arrived and found her influencer friends already seated at our table, tech entrepreneurs she'd invited without telling me. Jason ran a food delivery app, Marcus had a cryptocurrency platform, and David was launching a social media analytics company. They greeted me politely but immediately launched into conversations about user acquisition costs, venture capital funding, and scaling digital platforms. I sat there feeling like an outsider at my own anniversary dinner, listening to them discuss 7-figure valuations while I worked with my hands to restore boats one at a time. That's when Brittany delivered the crushing blow that ended everything. She started comparing my boat restoration business to her friends' tech companies, calling it a dying industry and wondering aloud why I didn't have the ambition to build something that could scale beyond Charleston's harbor. Her friends nodded along as she described me as someone who was content staying small, working with his hands instead of building something that mattered. Then came the moment that still makes my blood run cold. She suggested, with her friends nodding, that maybe we should just be friends with benefits while she found someone more suitable for her public image, someone whose success story would enhance her brand instead of limiting it. She needed someone whose achievements would look impressive in her content, not a guy who spent his days covered in varnish working on projects that most people would never understand. I sat there processing what I'd just heard from the woman I'd been planning to propose to, delivered in front of strangers at the restaurant I'd moved mountains to get us into for our special night. The humiliation was complete. She'd essentially told me I wasn't good enough to be her real boyfriend, just adequate enough to keep around for convenience while she searched for someone who fit her brand better. Then something clicked into place, a calm clarity that surprised me. I signaled for our server, calmly requested the check for the entire table including her friend's expensive meals, and pulled out my credit card without complaint. When the bill came to over $400, I signed it with steady hands and stood up. I told Brittany she could find her own way home and wished her friends good luck, then walked out knowing our relationship was completely over. As I drove home through Charleston's quiet streets, I felt something unexpected, relief that she'd finally shown me exactly who she really was underneath all the lifestyle content and carefully curated perfection. 2 days after the restaurant disaster, I was in my workshop sanding down the hull of a 1960s Chris Craft when I heard someone knock on the side door. I looked up to find Sarah, Brittany's younger sister, standing there with a cardboard box and an apologetic expression. Sarah was everything Brittany wasn't, quieter, more thoughtful, with an intelligence that didn't need constant validation through social media likes. She worked as a marine biology research specialist at the South Carolina Marine Research Institute, studying coastal ecosystem preservation, which meant she actually understood the waters I worked on every day. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked over, surprised to see her instead of Brittany herself. She explained she was there to collect Brittany's belongings that had been left at my place. A few books, some clothes, jewelry, and an expensive purse she'd been looking for. Sarah seemed genuinely embarrassed about the whole situation, apologizing repeatedly for her sister's behavior at the restaurant even though she hadn't witnessed it. She mentioned that Brittany had been staying with her since our breakup, turning her spare bedroom into some kind of social media command center. As we loaded her sister's things into the box, Sarah's eyes kept drifting to the boats in various stages of restoration throughout my workshop. She asked thoughtful questions about the process, genuinely curious about how I brought these vessels back to life. When I showed her the Chris Craft's original mahogany planking that I'd been painstakingly restoring, her face lit up with the kind of appreciation Brittany had never shown. She understood that what I did wasn't just fixing old boats, it was preserving history, maintaining craftsmanship that was disappearing from the modern world. We ended up talking for over an hour about my work and hers, finding unexpected common ground in our shared passion for preserving things that mattered. Sarah told me about her research into microplastic contamination in Charleston Harbor and how vintage boats like mine, properly maintained, actually had less environmental impact than many modern fiberglass vessels. Her knowledge of marine ecosystems gave her a deeper appreciation for the boats I restored and the waters they sailed. She explained how traditional wooden boat construction using natural materials created a smaller carbon footprint compared to modern manufacturing. I learned she'd been engaged to some finance executive named Brandon for 8 months, but she described him with the same detached tone Brittany had used when talking about my work. Brandon apparently considered her marine biology career a temporary phase before she settled into something more practical, like event planning or interior design. He was successful on paper with an impressive portfolio and downtown condo, but had never once asked about her research or shown interest in environmental conservation. As she spoke about him, I recognized the same look of quiet resignation I'd probably worn during those last months with Brittany, the expression of someone who'd been made to feel their passion wasn't valuable enough. When Sarah picked up one of my restoration journals, carefully reading my notes about preserving original hardware and matching period-appropriate materials, I realized this was the first time anyone had looked at my work with genuine respect and understanding. She asked insightful questions about sustainable restoration practices and how my methods aligned with environmental stewardship. The conversation felt natural and engaging in ways that talking with Brittany never had, even in our best times. Sarah understood the patience required to restore something properly rather than rushing to make it look good for photos. As we talked, I found myself explaining techniques I'd developed for minimizing waste during restoration and using traditional materials that would age naturally. She nodded along with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions that showed she truly understood the complexity of balancing historical accuracy with environmental responsibility. As Sarah prepared to leave with her sister's belongings, she paused at the door and looked back at my workshop with something that looked like longing. She mentioned that Brandon had been pressuring her to move to Atlanta for his career advancement, away from the coastal research that defined her professional identity. I found myself hoping she wouldn't make that sacrifice, though I kept that thought to myself. After she left, I realized I'd spent 2 hours talking passionately about my work without once feeling like I needed to justify or apologize for it. For the first time in months, someone had made me feel like what I did actually mattered, and that feeling stayed with me long after her car disappeared down the harbor road. Within a week, Brittany had launched a social media campaign designed to salvage her reputation and paint me as the villain in our breakup story. She posted carefully crafted content about toxic relationships and men who couldn't handle strong, independent women pursuing their dreams. The posts were full of vague references to emotional manipulation and financial control, clearly meant to make her followers think I'd been some kind of abuser rather than the guy who'd paid for her lifestyle for 3 years. Her comment sections filled with supportive messages from people who had no idea what actually happened, all rallying around her narrative of escaping a controlling relationship. What Brittany didn't count on was that several people from Magnolias had been recording that night, capturing her cruel performance for their own social media content. The restaurant was popular with Charleston's social scene, and witnessing a public breakup involving a local influencer was apparently too good not to document. By the time her victim posts gained traction, videos of her actual behavior started surfacing across different platforms. The footage showed her laughing with her friends as she systematically tore me down, suggesting the friends with benefits arrangement while I sat there in stunned silence, and her obvious surprise when I calmly paid the bill and walked away. The contrast between her social media victim narrative and the reality of her restaurant performance was devastating to her credibility. Her follower count, which had been steadily climbing towards 60,000, began dropping as brands started distancing themselves from the negative publicity. Companies that had been sending her free products for lifestyle posts suddenly went quiet, and collaboration offers dried up almost overnight. The algorithm that had been boosting her content seemed to turn against her as engagement plummeted and her posts reached fewer people. Meanwhile, I found myself unexpectedly busy as word spread about how I'd handled the situation with dignity and professionalism. Clients who had witnessed or heard about the restaurant incident began referring friends and colleagues to my workshop, impressed by my composure under pressure. The same qualities Brittany had mocked, my dedication to craftsmanship, my focus on doing things right rather than fast, my commitment to preserving something meaningful, suddenly became selling points that attracted exactly the kind of clients I wanted to work with. Sarah and I began running into each other more frequently, first at the coffee shop near the harbor, then at a local environmental conservation meeting where she was presenting research findings and I was there to learn about sustainable business practices. Our conversations grew longer each time, moving beyond our initial connection over work to discover shared values about authenticity, environmental responsibility, and the importance of doing meaningful work rather than chasing trends. I learned that she'd been questioning her engagement to Brandon for months, feeling increasingly isolated as he dismissed her career achievements and pressured her to prioritize his social connections over her research commitments. The more time Sarah and I spent together, the more obvious it became that we understood each other in ways our respective partners never had. When she mentioned a research project about sustainable tourism's impact on marine environments, I suggested collaborating on a study of how traditional boat restoration could support eco-friendly maritime tourism. The idea excited both of us, combining her environmental expertise with my knowledge of historic vessels and tourism patterns. 3 weeks after our first conversation in my workshop, Sarah called to tell me she'd ended her engagement to Brandon. She'd realized that spending time with someone who valued her work had shown her how wrong it felt to be with someone who saw her career as an inconvenience. Brandon's reaction was predictably focused on appearances and social embarrassment rather than any genuine heartbreak, which only confirmed she'd made the right decision. Our professional collaboration quickly evolved into something more personal as we discovered how naturally we work together, both intellectually and creatively. Sarah brought scientific rigor to my restoration projects, helping me document environmental benefits and develop more sustainable practices, while I helped her understand the cultural and historical context that made maritime preservation meaningful to coastal communities. Brittany's social media presence continued its spectacular decline as former followers lost interest in her increasingly desperate attempts to regain relevance, while Sarah and I quietly built something real based on mutual respect, shared values, and authentic connection rather than public image validation. 2 months after her social media downfall, Brittany made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative by threatening legal action against both Sarah and me. She claimed we'd engaged in conspiracy to damage her reputation and interfere with her business relationships, seeking financial compensation for lost influencer income and emotional distress. The legal papers arrived at my workshop on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who seemed embarrassed to be serving what was clearly a frivolous lawsuit. Sarah received similar papers at her research facility the same day, alleging that she'd sabotaged her own sister's relationship to pursue her own romantic interests. The accusations were so far-fetched that my lawyer actually laughed when I showed him the documents, explaining that Brittany would have to prove we'd somehow orchestrated her public meltdown at Magnolia's and forced her to post her own contradictory social media content. Within weeks, Brittany's legal threats collapsed entirely when her own Instagram posts, stories, and public behavior provided ironclad evidence against her claims. Her lawyer quietly withdrew from the case after realizing that every piece of documentation actually supported our version of events rather than hers. The depositions never happened because there was literally no case to make. She'd documented her own poor behavior so thoroughly that pursuing legal action would have only brought more negative attention to her already damaged reputation. Meanwhile, the public documentation of my professionalism throughout the entire ordeal had an unexpected positive effect on my business. Wealthy clients who valued discretion and integrity began seeking out my restoration services specifically because they'd heard about how I'd handled the situation with dignity rather than engaging in public drama. Word of mouth in Charleston's tight-knit maritime community spread quickly, and I found myself booked solid with projects from collectors who appreciated both quality craftsmanship and personal character. The irony wasn't lost on me that Brittany's attempts to damage my reputation had actually enhanced it among exactly the clientele I most wanted to work with. Sarah's family dynamics shifted dramatically during this period as well, with her parents and extended relatives finally witnessing Brittany's behavior firsthand when she showed up uninvited to their father's birthday dinner demanding family support for her legal campaign. What had been years of subtle favoritism toward the more glamorous daughter evaporated instantly when Brittany threw a public tantrum about Sarah stealing her boyfriend and ruining her life. The family gathering that night became a turning point where everyone saw clearly which daughter had actually built something meaningful with her life and which one had been coasting on appearances and entitlement. Her parents, who had always been quietly concerned about Brittany's lifestyle choices but hesitant to criticize her apparent success, finally acknowledged that Sarah had been the responsible one all along. They expressed genuine pride in Sarah's research work and admitted they'd never really understood what Brittany actually did for a living beyond taking photos of herself in expensive locations. The family's support shifted decisively towards Sarah and our relationship, recognizing that we'd found something authentic together while Brittany continued making increasingly erratic choices that alienated everyone around her. By the time autumn arrived, Brittany's influencer career had completely collapsed, with her follower count dropping below 20,000 and no brand partnerships remaining. Her desperate attempts to rebrand herself as a victim-turned-survivor fell flat because too many people had witnessed or documented her actual behavior. She'd burned through her savings trying to maintain her lifestyle without income, eventually moving back in with her parents after being evicted from her apartment. Meanwhile, Sarah and I had not only survived Brittany's attempts at sabotage but emerged stronger and more committed to each other. Our collaborative work on sustainable maritime tourism had attracted grant funding from environmental organizations impressed by our innovative approach to combining historical preservation with ecological stewardship. The project that had started as an excuse to spend time together had evolved into groundbreaking research that neither of us could have accomplished alone. Our professional success ran parallel to our personal happiness as we discovered that partnership built on mutual respect and shared values created opportunities we'd never imagined possible when we were settling for less with people who didn't truly value what we brought to the table. 18 months after that disastrous anniversary dinner at Magnolia's, Sarah and I had built something extraordinary together that went far beyond either of our individual achievements. Our eco-maritime business had grown from a simple collaboration into a thriving operation that combined boat restoration with marine conservation education, attracting clients from across the Southeast who wanted both authentic craftsmanship and environmental stewardship. We'd purchased a historic waterfront property that served as both my expanded workshop and Sarah's research facility, creating a unique space where vintage boats were restored using sustainable practices while visitors learned about coastal ecosystem preservation. The timing felt perfect for the next step in our relationship, so I planned a proposal that honored both our shared values and the journey that had brought us together. Sarah's family had been hosting their annual beach house reunion for over 2 decades, a long weekend gathering where 3 generations came together to celebrate their coastal roots and family connections. This year marked the first time I'd been invited as Sarah's official partner rather than just a friend, and I knew this was the moment to ask her to marry me. The setting couldn't have been more appropriate, surrounded by the ocean that defined both our careers, with family members who had watched our relationship develop from friendship into genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. I'd worked with a local jeweler to design a ring that incorporated materials from one of our restoration projects, using recycled gold and a sustainable diamond mounted in a setting that resembled the brass fittings from the Chris Craft where we'd first really connected. The ring represented everything we'd built together: beautiful, meaningful, environmentally conscious, and rooted in the maritime heritage that had brought us together. On Saturday evening, as the family gathered on the beach house deck for their traditional sunset celebration, I made the announcement that Sarah and I had some news to share about our future together. Before I could get the ring out of my pocket, however, a car door slammed in the driveway with enough force to rattle the house windows. Everyone turned to see Brittany storming up the beach house steps, looking like she'd driven straight from Charleston without stopping to consider whether she was welcome at a family gathering she hadn't attended in 3 years. Her appearance was shocking. Gone was the carefully curated influencer aesthetic, replaced by someone who looked genuinely desperate and unhinged. She'd gained weight, her hair was unkempt, and she wore clothes that looked like they'd been slept in. But what struck me most was the wild look in her eyes, like someone who'd completely lost touch with reality and was operating purely on rage and entitlement. She pushed through the confused family members gathering around the deck, pointing an accusatory finger directly at Sarah and me as we stood together near the railing. The words that came out of her mouth were so delusional and bitter that several family members actually stepped back in shock. She accused us of conspiring against her from the beginning, claiming that we'd planned our relationship before my breakup with her and that Sarah had manipulated me into ending things with her specifically so she could steal me away. According to Brittany's increasingly frantic narrative, Sarah had been jealous of her success and had seduced me as part of some elaborate revenge scheme to destroy her influencer career and ruin her life. She demanded that the family choose sides, insisting that they needed to support her against Sarah's betrayal and manipulation. What happened next was something I'll never forget as long as I live. Instead of the shocked silence or family division that Brittany clearly expected, her relatives began responding with a mixture of embarrassment, frustration, and genuine concern for her mental state. Her own mother stepped forward and told her that she was embarrassing herself and needed to leave immediately before she said something that would permanently damage her relationships with people who actually cared about her. Her father, usually the peacemaker in family situations, looked genuinely disgusted as he pointed out that Sarah and I had built something meaningful together while Brittany had spent the same time making increasingly poor choices that had alienated everyone who'd ever tried to help her. The family members who had once been charmed by Brittany's social media persona now saw clearly what she'd become: entitled, delusional, and completely lacking in self-awareness or accountability for her own actions. 2 years after that catastrophic restaurant scene, Sarah and I were 3 days away from our wedding at the Maritime Heritage Center we'd built together when Brittany made her final, most desperate attempt to sabotage our happiness. Our venue was perfect, a restored waterfront facility where historic boats served as backdrops for our ceremony while interactive exhibits educated visitors about marine conservation. The space represented everything we'd accomplished together, combining my restoration expertise with Sarah's environmental research into something meaningful. Wedding preparations had been going smoothly, with family and friends arriving to celebrate with us at a venue that truly reflected who we were as a couple. Sarah's parents had thrown themselves into the planning with genuine enthusiasm, finally having a daughter whose life choices they could wholeheartedly support. 3 days before the ceremony, I was putting finishing touches on a 1940s sailing yacht that would serve as the altar backdrop when I heard heels clicking across our facility's wooden floors with unmistakable urgency. I looked up to see Brittany marching through our maritime center, her appearance showing clear signs of the financial hardship that had become her reality since her influencer career collapsed. Gone were the designer clothes, replaced by discount store fashion and a desperation that radiated from every gesture. She looked around our facility with obvious envy and resentment, taking in the restored boats and wedding decorations with the bitter expression of someone who couldn't understand how others had succeeded where she had failed. She walked straight up to me with the aggressive confidence that comes from having nothing left to lose, announcing that she had crucial information about my past that Sarah needed to know before making the biggest mistake of her life. According to Brittany's increasingly unhinged narrative, I had been manipulating and grooming Sarah from the moment I met her, using my knowledge of her family dynamics and relationship problems with Brandon to position myself as her savior while systematically destroying her sister's life and career. She claimed to have evidence that I'd orchestrated our entire relationship as an elaborate revenge scheme against her, designed to steal away everything she cared about and leave her with nothing while I built a new life with her sister. The accusations were so absurd and delusional that I almost felt sorry for her. Here was someone who had become so disconnected from reality that she genuinely believed the fantasy narrative she'd constructed to avoid taking responsibility for her own choices. Sarah arrived just as Brittany was reaching the climax of her conspiracy theory rant, having heard raised voices from the research lab. Behind her came several of our wedding party members and family relatives who witnessed firsthand as Brittany made increasingly wild accusations about manipulation, revenge, and systematic psychological abuse. The contrast between Brittany's desperate, unhinged performance and Sarah's calm, confident response couldn't have been more stark, as Sarah listened patiently before responding with the kind of measured intelligence that had first attracted me to her. Sarah pointed out that Brittany's timeline made no sense. She'd ended her engagement to Brandon months before she and I had our first real conversation, and our relationship had developed naturally over shared professional interests rather than any kind of manipulation. She reminded everyone present that they'd all witnessed our relationship develop organically from friendship to partnership to love, based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than any hidden agenda. Family members who had been quietly observing Brittany's decline over the past 2 years finally spoke up, expressing their frustration with her inability to take responsibility for her own choices and her constant attempts to blame others for the consequences of her behavior. Security arrived within minutes of being called, finding Brittany in the middle of what could only be described as a complete breakdown as she continued making increasingly bizarre claims about stolen opportunities and family betrayal. As they escorted her from our maritime center, she kept shouting about how Sarah and I had ruined her life and stolen everything that should have been hers, apparently unable to understand that we'd built something entirely new rather than taking anything that had ever belonged to her. The incident left everyone shaken but also strangely relieved. Seeing Brittany's complete disconnection from reality made it clear that cutting ties with her had been the right choice, and that the life Sarah and I had built together was worth protecting from people who couldn't appreciate authentic happiness. The wedding proceeded beautifully on a perfect Charleston morning, with the Atlantic Ocean providing a stunning backdrop as Sarah and I exchanged vows aboard the restored 1940s sailing yacht that had become the centerpiece of our Maritime Heritage Center. The ceremony felt like a celebration not just of our love, but of everything we'd built together: the boats we'd saved from decay, the research we'd conducted, the community we'd served, and the authentic partnership we discovered when we stopped settling for people who didn't truly value what we brought to the world. Sarah looked radiant in a simple but elegant dress that perfectly captured her natural beauty and intelligence, while I wore a navy suit that felt appropriate for a man whose life revolved around the sea and the vessels that sailed upon it. Our vows focused not on grand romantic gestures but on the quiet promises that actually matter in a marriage: to support each other's passions, to build something meaningful together, to weather whatever storms might come with the same teamwork that had carried us through Brittany's attempts to destroy what we'd found. The guest list perfectly reflected the life we'd created, filled with maritime historians who appreciated the historical significance of our work, environmental scientists who respected Sarah's research contributions, craftsmen who understood the value of preservation, and family members who had watched our relationship develop from authentic friendship into genuine partnership. As we exchanged rings made from materials salvaged from our restoration projects, I couldn't help but think about how different this moment was from the proposal I'd once planned for Brittany at that same restaurant where she'd suggested we be friends with benefits instead. Looking back, I realized that Brittany's cruel ultimatum at Magnolia's had been the best thing that ever happened to me, freeing me from a relationship built on surface-level attraction and social media compatibility to find something real with someone who understood and valued the work that defined my life. Sarah's family, who had once quietly worried about both their daughters' choices, now beamed with genuine pride as they watched their younger daughter marry someone who celebrated her intelligence, supported her career, and shared her commitment to making a meaningful difference in the world rather than just chasing social media fame or financial success. The reception took place throughout our maritime center, with guests exploring the restored boats and learning about our conservation efforts while enjoying locally sourced food that reflected our commitment to environmental stewardship. During our first dance, I caught Sarah's eye and we both smiled, knowing that we'd found something rare, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of authentic connection that grows stronger over time rather than fading when the initial excitement wears off. The evening concluded with a sunset cruise aboard one of the vintage boats I'd restored, surrounded by the people who mattered most to us as we sailed into Charleston Harbor while Sarah pointed out the marine life she'd been studying and protecting throughout her career. As we stood together at the bow of that beautifully restored vessel, watching the Charleston skyline fade behind us, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment, from that disastrous anniversary dinner where I'd learned what I didn't want in a partner, to this perfect beginning of a marriage with someone who appreciated everything I'd been made to feel was inadequate or unambitious. The future stretched ahead of us like the endless ocean, full of possibilities for expanding our maritime education programs, continuing Sarah's research, and building a life centered on the work we loved rather than the image we projected to others. Brittany had been right about one thing. I wasn't marriage material for her, someone who valued surface appearances over substance, social media metrics over genuine achievement, and personal branding over authentic connection. But I was exactly what Sarah needed, just as she was exactly what I needed. A partner who understood that true success comes from building something meaningful together, preserving what matters, and finding purpose in work that serves something greater than ourselves. That night, as we settled into our new life as husband and wife in the home we'd created overlooking the harbor where we both worked, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong and everything to do with finally finding where I belonged.